A very warm welcome to the holiday in Brighton and the Labour Party conference. My name is Meg Hillier and I'm the Member of Parliament for Hackney South and Shoreditch, and I have the privilege of chairing the House of Commons Public Accounts Committee. And I've been very privileged to work with PCS on a number of the issues we've been raising through that committee, particularly around how HMRC is closing offices, how it's not collecting enough tax and not closing tax loopholes. So it's a real pleasure to be here tonight with a shadow front bench team and PCS and Tax Justice all hopefully pulling in the same direction once we're in power to actually close some of those tax loopholes and deal with some of the international tax issues that my committee and I have been bringing to the fore. And it was actually through my committee that we made the only change in law in the last short parliament we had, when my colleague Caroline Flint took something we did in committee and managed to get an amendment to a government bill. So it does show that even in opposition we can push the government to do things differently. It's sometimes harder, a lot harder, and we want to not be in that position, but we can make a difference, and it's thanks to support of some of the people on this table that we've been able to do that. So that's a little bit about me, and that's the end of my comments, because I'm keen to introduce the speakers. As you can see, two of them are not yet with us because they're obviously in high demand. So we will come to John and Mark when they arrive. So Anneliese Dodds is our new shadow member of the Treasury team, fresh from hot foot from Europe. She was elected one of our new members, defeating winning the seat in Oxford, in Oxford East in June of this year. So, very warm welcome.
Thank you very much. And just as Meg has done, I'd really like to thank PCS for all of its work, both organising this meeting, but above all for the work that it's done and that its members do day in, day out, fighting for tax justice, against tax avoidance and evasion, and also against money laundering as well. That work, I think, is more important than ever. We obviously have, I think, at the moment, a government which isn't really concerned about protecting government revenue, quite the opposite. I mean, we just calculated within the Shadow Treasury team that we think the government has said goodbye to about £70 billion through the fact that it's decided to obviously cut corporation tax, also capital gains taxes and other taxes from people who could afford them. So that's not including the increase in the personal allowance. That's taxes that we think were necessary to pay for a decent society. But of course the government's also leaking revenue because it's failing to take action against tax dodging. So it's making the situation worse through the back door as well as through the front door. And I think we really saw that in spades in the debate that we had recently over the finance bill, which came around again after the general election. So the government put forward kind of half of a finance bill, all the bits it thought it could get through initially, and then the rest very recently in the House of Commons. And the government really trumpeted that bill as, particularly they said, removing non-dom status. They said this would get rid of non-dom status. But you look at the detail and you see in practice it did nothing of the sort. First of all, the rules gave non-doms 15 years of grace to sort out their affairs. A period for compliance that, if we're talking about, say, working tax credit overpayment, we don't see very often in the applied to others, do we? The new arrangements also protected offshore trusts. Here is ever a complete blind spot, I think, for the Conservative government. And the new arrangements don't cover people if, as a non-dom, your parents were non-doms, which, funnily enough, happens quite a lot. You really couldn't make it up. Obviously, Labour's got a different vision when it comes to tax avoidance and evasion. We've set that out in our anti-tax avoidance and evasion plan. I'm not going to go through all of it because it's a 17-point plan, which would be pretty boring to kind of go through all the different 17 points, but I suppose just really quickly to rattle through some of those. First of all, we feel that we really need to have a proper inquiry around particularly the Panama Papers and how they affected Britain. We've had great work done, obviously, by Meg, by Margaret, by others, working in some of the select committees and the committees in Parliament, but we really need to have a proper inquiry into some of the recent scandals. We need that to occur independently. We also need to have a proper operational list for tax havens as well. I found in the European Parliament that our government was lobbying against that measure coming from the EU. Instead, we should be supporting it because we don't have that list currently with real teeth. When the OECD tried to produce that list, it effectively was gamed by different tax havens who said that they were compliant around certain transparency measures, but they were still engaged in harmful tax practices. We need to have a list with bite. We also need to have measures around transparency for beneficial ownership, which are effective. It's good that the government has said that we're now, well, it has put into place a requirement for companies to provide information about who really owns them. But as you'll have seen, people who followed this, there's quite a bit of evidence that many different companies that we would have expected to be on that list to indicate who they're owned by are not on there, including some people who are suspected to be involved with money laundering. So that register of beneficial ownership has got holes in it, and we need to make sure it's totally watertight. And also I think that this is occurring in a situation where we know that many of those people who want to hide ownership are using a number of different vehicles, shell companies and so forth, to try and make it more and more opaque. We also, of course, need to have proper transparency for trust, what's becoming really the Achilles heel, I think, of the British financial system. As we're moving to having more transparency for companies, the government's consistently said it can't provide that for trusts. And believe me, I've had every argument about why we can't do this. You would think that every orphan in Britain has a trust which is intended to look after them. But the reality is there can be protections put in place to protect those vulnerable people who have trusts there to look after their financial future, but still to have the transparency we need to catch those people who are using them as a mechanism for tax avoidance, evasion and money laundering. We'd also have, as Labour, a general anti-avoidance rule, which would give tax authorities the ability to get out of the cat and mouse game of always having to produce new regulations to catch new tax avoidance schemes, rather than being able to be more flexible. And of course we'd end those sweetheart tax deals which have led to a situation where many multinational companies are able to play the tax system in a way that smaller companies can't. But above all, we would provide HMRC with adequate resources to actually enforce the rules that currently exist. Because we know that money intelligently invested in HMRC pays dividends. I know the PCS has done a lot of research into this. They've calculated that for each tax inspector dedicated to compliance, they bring in £650,000 net of staff costs, so net of the cost for that member of staff per year. And the Special Investigations Unit, which fought the most complex tax avoidance cases, has yielded 450 times its initial cost in tax revenue that came in. But instead of boosting capacity, despite the marginal increase we've had recently, the government keeps saying to us, oh, well, we have increased recently, but it's very small, that increase compared to the fall-off in numbers we had before, and we're still well below HMRC's original capacity. I do have to say here, though, that reduction did start in 2008. So I think we need to learn lessons from what's happened there. It's clear that with those shortages, a lot of HMRC staff morale is quite low. Staff surveys have shown that. And I'm concerned that will intensify as local offices are changed into regional offices, with potentially the loss of about 5,000 staff who can't just move to a new place. We've got caring responsibilities, other reasons why they can't just shift. And I think this is occurring at the same time as people who are looking to avoid or evade tax and engage in money laundering are becoming more and more sophisticated. So we need an adequately resourced HMRC, the one that can take the action that's needed. But it's also not just about dealing with that, obviously, tax avoidance and evasion. It's also about enabling people who work for HMRC to do the job that they want to do. And I've talked to a number of people who feel so uncomfortable about the fact that they can't provide the quality of service they want to provide. And that applies across the piece. Many people also talking about the treatment of small taxpayers. And when we raised this in the House of Commons, the government response that came back was, but it's all online. It's all going online. You don't need any people anymore. Well, those of us who have some experience of this, who've got constituents who've had experience of different systems, know that actually the opposite can often be the case. The Making Tax Digital project is continuing, albeit delayed, one whereby people will have to report much more frequently, people who haven't had to use digital systems for tax reporting before. So we need to support staff so that the support is there and we don't have a big knock-on impact on the rest of our small business sector and our economy. So I'm really looking forward to the rest of the discussion tonight. I'm looking forward to continuing to work with PCS as well and other people across the labour movement, across the NGO sector, to continue trying to develop a concrete plan for delivering tax justice. Thanks very much for everyone for being here.
To have you now with us in Westminster with your track record expertise in the European Parliament. So your expertise is a real bonus. So we thank Anneliese again. Anneliese also mentioned the issue around HMRC office closures. Just to tell you what this government's like, it was during PERDA, during the general election, that they made a decision to close an office in Livingston in Scotland and move it to Edinburgh, in spite of some very good evidence showing how almost impossible it is for staff to actually get on the trains to get to Edinburgh from Livingston. I mean, as simple as that. These are quite clear measures, and yet the government's moving fast. And HMRC is one of the biggest numbers of changes going through it. And as chair of the Public Accounts Committee, I've highlighted it as a department to really be to watch closely, because so much change is happening. It's really hard for staff to get on and do their jobs. And just to give a flavour, Anneliese talked about the money that staff bring in. We looked at VAT online fraud on the Public Accounts Committee just 2 weeks ago, and over £1 billion is being lost every year. And yet we're giving 10 billion to the DUP. Well, we're not, but you know, they are. And the government just had this windfall of 10 billion in government debt that they think they've got. So you know, that's a chunk of money, just online VAT alone. That's the most recent figure.